The balance of nature is delicate. In the infinitely random process of evolution, the sheer number of possible adaptations and mutations are unfathomable. And despite this, nature has to keep a fine balance of food chains, ecosystems, and environments, lest they all disappear. And this means that, occasionally, life will find a creative and unorthodox method of maintaining order. As evolution sometimes produces fierce, untamable problems, it will often in turn also produce an equally fierce solution, and, in the process, give birth to some of the most fascinating organisms in all of nature. The circle of life is a circle of competition. As every organism strives to pass on its genes in a collective effort to maintain the species, it is inevitable that frictions will occur. To live in nature is to live in a constant struggle not just for survival, but for your own ecological niche. This concept is based around the idea that in order to survive, every species must find a specific way of life, a specific corner of an ecosystem where it can integrate itself and its adaptation into the circle of life, hence the term niche. Finding their niche is essential for all organisms since failure means being selected out of existence. However, these niches are rarely uncontested and often lead to conflict as multiple species fight to fill it. But in some cases, that fight for dominance becomes the niche itself, where two or more species keep each other in check by ways of constant competition. Because of this interaction, some species evolve specifically around the concept of competition and dominance, becoming a sort of balancing mechanism. And while some are sneaky and covert, others can become quite spectacular. This is the case for today's monster, the flying menace of the New World, the explosive flying wyvern. The Bazelgeuse. Called explosive scale wyvern by the natives of the New World, this sauropod is a fierce force to be reckoned with. At an average length of 19 meters, it far exceeds the normally slender and small frames of most flying wyverns, its massive, cone-shaped body being carried through the winds by gigantic wings and balanced by a long, bulbous tail. Its massive body doesn't, however, limit its ability to fly, which is very odd. Most flying creatures evolve to either be small and light, or have hollow bone structures and fast digestive systems as to keep the body as lightweight as possible. None of this seems to be the case for Bazelgeuse, which implies that it stays in the sky purely by the potentially enormous muscle strength and buoyancy of its wings. However, as the name suggests, the distinguishing feature of this monster are the numerous large scales hanging from its torso and the tip of its tail. The name scales is actually not correct here, as these growths do not cover or merge with the skin, rather just dangling off of the creature's body. In fact, these so-called scales are actually chunks of an explosive liquid that the Bazelgeuse secretes, which hardens when in contact with air. This is similar to the Carabidae bugs, or bombardier beetles, which are known to spray out an explosive mixture of body liquids when threatened. However, while the Carabidae's liquid explodes as it is sprayed, the liquid produced by the Bazelgeuse instead reacts differently. When it first leaves the beast's body, it enters a solid state, hardening and taking up the infamous scale-like shape. It then hangs off the beast's body until it is willingly detached. How this mechanism works is still unknown, as the Bazelgeuse has only been discovered recently. What is known, however, is what happens once they are detached. The growths drop to the ground and sit dormant, seemingly harmless. That is, however, until subjected to enough force, for example if something steps on it or hits it. If that happens, the growth violently explodes, causing a flame strike of about 1 meter in radius. This property implies that this secretion is similar in structure to nitroglycerin, as many compounds of that nature also tend to explode on impact. This unique defense mechanism grants the Bazelgeuse a wide array of possibilities when it comes to survival and combat. Its preferred method, however, seems to be to cover a vast area with these natural bombs of sorts by flying back and forth and dropping them in clusters. Its usual follow-up is to then violently crash into the opponent out of full flight, inflicting severe damage upon impact and causing tremors that detonate the bombs. This part of its behavior is particularly interesting, as it is incredibly atypical for flying creatures. Because most airborne organisms are so light in order to stay in the air, they avoid collisions at all costs. A maneuver like this would prove almost certainly fatal for a common eagle or a legiana, as their body frames are just way too light. This means that not only is the Bazelgeuse uncharacteristically massive for a flying wyvern, it is also incredibly robust. And robust it must be, as this monster engages in some of the most aggressive and violent behavior seen in the natural world, matched only by the likes of Deviljho and Rajang. As evolution goes on, nature can and will produce beasts of fierce strength and ferocity, predators that know no equal. But if the natural balance is to be preserved, these beings must be opposed and kept in check. And one answer to this issue that emerged is the Bazelgeuse. Its behavior is that of an invader. While it originates in the volcanic recesses of the New World, it will travel long distances, with some rare sightings even being documented in the Old World. Once it finds a new environment it deems suitable for its purposes, it sets itself one singular goal: become the undisputed top of the food chain. This may seem similar to the Deviljho. However, there is one distinct difference. The Deviljho will move from ecosystem to ecosystem and prey on anything it finds in order to satisfy its never-ending hunger. This means it will hunt anything and do it for food. Meanwhile, the Bazelgeuse will exclusively attempt to pick fights with the strongest monsters it can find. While it may occasionally engage with the likes of Jagras and Gyros to show who's boss, it's way more common for it to book it straight to the apex monster of the area and try to take it down. And even more curiously, it doesn't seem to feed on what it kills, implying that it doesn't fight to eat. This has caused much debate in the research commission. What purpose might this behavior serve? Fighting creatures like Anjanath and Odogaron is immensely tiring, so what could possibly justify such a tremendous expense of energy? Some have suggested that the fierce competition that it likely faced in its original habitat, the Elder's Recess, must have ingrained an innate desire for superiority and dominance, but as things stand now, there is no way to confirm it. All we are left with is a fiercely violent, aggressive, and invasive flying bomba. And invasive it definitely is. This monster will pinpoint and hunt any creature it deems worthy of its time and immediately engage them in a battle to the death. This includes hunters. Between the aforementioned bombs, its massive tail, and a short-ranged yet deadly fire breath, the Bazelgeuse is well equipped to handle most of the enemies it makes for itself. And beyond just its normal ability, it, like many monsters, has a last resort. Should a challenge prove too difficult, the Bazelgeuse can enter what scholars have been calling a superheated mode. In this state, the beast raises its body temperature by several magnitudes, to the point that the skin under its dorsal scales begins emitting a red-hot glow. In this state, the bomb-like growths do not solidify fully even once they are exposed to air, due to the additional temperature. They remain partially liquid and hot even after detaching from the body, which is when they become truly dangerous. The heat causes parts of the liquid in the middle of the growth to break down into a different composition, which is capable to react with the original liquid. The ensuing reaction is exothermic, which means that it releases energy in the form of heat. This means that the scales perpetually heat up until eventually they explode by themselves, regardless of whether they're struck or not. This, coupled with the fact that the bombs drop and develop much faster due to the heat, makes a superheated Bazelgeuse an enormous threat to anything within bombing distance. However, Even a creature as outlandish as this has to follow basic rules of nature. While it is unclear how exactly the beast heats up its body, it's assumed it possesses one or more specialized organs for it, in the torso and possibly in the tail. This means that the heating process is localized and focused on heating up the relevant areas as opposed to the whole body. And while that is certainly impressive, it comes at a risk. While the heating may be localized, should the process go on for long enough, the heat is bound to begin spreading throughout the entire body. Should this happen, the Bazelgeuse may find itself in mortal danger. Vital organs, as well as many of the structures in the nervous system, are reliant on structural and functional proteins. These proteins, however, are not particularly heat resistant. At around 42 degrees Celsius, most of them will enter a process called coagulation, which means that their shape and composition gets twisted and changed by the heat. You may know it from boiling an egg, as the egg whites solidify into a spongy mass. And just as you can't unboil an egg, coagulation is virtually irreversible. This means that, should the heat produced by its auxiliary organs reach the vital areas of the Bazelgeuse, it would almost certainly die an excruciating death, most of its vital functions breaking down as the proteins begin changing their shape into something useless. To prevent this, it will reasonably turn off its superheated mode if the encounter ends up taking too long. This is also the only circumstance under which a Bazelgeuse will retreat in order to recuperate. All of these factors re-emphasize what the Bazelgeuse fundamentally is. It's a balancing tip of the scale, a way for nature to ensure that no one species uproots a system for too long. As monsters like the Deviljho dominate a certain ecosystem and endanger it, the Bazelgeuse swoops in to dethrone it, only for itself to be pushed away shortly after by the same or maybe a different species. This push and pull relationship ensures that, even in the chaos of competition, there is a pattern, a rhythmic poetry to which all of nature swings and dances. And a part of Bazelgeuse's role is to be adaptive. As it is bound to cross paths with many different opponents, it has to be able to compete against a great many different types of enemies, many of which vary widely in strength and ability. And while nature bestowed the Bazelgeuse with a creative and powerful weapon, rapid and drastic changes to the environment will bring it to its limits and unveil the truly impressive potential of this beast's adaptability. During the Velkhana incident in the New World, which saw massive migrations of countless species, the Bazelgeuse now suddenly had to compete with foes such as the explosion-proof Brachydios and the ferocious Tigrex. Due to the added pressure of having to combat such opponents that were simply too strong at the time, some individuals of Bazelgeuse species adapted and changed into the only known variant of this, the Seething Bazelgeuse. If the regular Bazelgeuse was already relatively unresearched due to how recently it's been discovered, then this variant is essentially a breakingly new find, with very little being definitively known about it aside from its existence. What little has been able to be confirmed, though, is as follows. The Seething Bazelgeuse looks very similar to its regular counterpart, and also behaves almost the same, with one stark difference. It does not patrol different environments anymore, instead sticking to the Elder's Recess, and focusing on remaining at the top there. Additionally, it seems to be even more picky about its foes now, this time however out of caution. It also appears to have additional heat insulation around the upper body, which allows it to keep its superheated state running far longer than a regular Bazelgeuse. However, both the true change and mystery of this variant lies in the bombs. While it can still produce the regular liquid it could before, it now is able to go even beyond. As it keeps producing its bombs, the composition of the liquid seems to change, creating not a brown shell or a red-hot glow, but instead a stretchy, purple substance that, once dropped to the ground, expands continuously until it bursts into a significantly larger explosion. Research has suggested that this is a gaseous expansion. However, at this point in time, there simply isn't enough raw data to conclude anything. Nonetheless, observations have shown that the Seething Bazelgeuse has significantly more control over these bombs, being able to launch them over large distances and intricate patterns. And to top it all off, it is now able to secrete the liquid in small portions all over its body, which can lead to it covering itself with it before diving straight into its target, leaving a truly massive explosion behind and covering any survivors in the liquid, afflicting blast blight. In essence, the Seething Bazelgeuse is a stronger but more cautious Bazelgeuse that has learned to pick its battles and has optimized its fighting capabilities. Nature is ever so resourceful, and the Bazelgeuse stands as one of nature's most bizarre and most fascinating ways of keeping order. As every organism barrels towards survival, procreation, and evolution, they all contribute to the maintaining of the natural balance. Some through passive existence, some through predation, and others, like the Bazelgeuse, through raw and unending competition. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Nature of Monster Hunter. If you wish to get more closely acquainted with this creature, click the link on screen and in the description to head on over to Zenrado's channel, where him and Neo work as the newly formed Field Research Division to explore these things in a more practical manner. You can join them as they hunt the creature in question and learn and see all kinds of new things about them. But for now, thank you for your support, and I hope to see you next time.